Hi, I'm Celeste, and this is the story of how I was erased from the very house I once called home, until the day I quietly wrote my name back in, not with rage, but with a truth they couldn't deny. While Delilah posed for magazine photos in the mansion we both grew up in, I was living 3 states away, sipping black coffee in a second-hand cardigan, waiting for a letter I didn't know would break me. They never meant for me to come back, but I did. Not with a lawyer, not with anger, just with a letter from Dad, and the truth that still had his handwriting on it. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever felt like they made space for everyone but you? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This isn't just a story about inheritance, it's about presence, and the kind of quiet that finally speaks. Let me show you what happened next. I hadn't heard from my mother in 3 years. The letter arrived folded inside a cream envelope. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting. The smell of bacon lingered low in the diner, mixing with the hiss of the griddle and the clink of ceramic mugs. My coffee had been refilled twice without a word. That's how they did things here in Asheville. No fuss, no questions. Just a nod and another warm pour. I stared at the envelope beside my plate, my eggs going cold, yolk untouched. Across from me, Graham read the classifieds like it was a Sunday ritual. He hadn't noticed the letter yet, or maybe he had and was giving me space. He was good at that, letting silence do the heavy lifting. When we got home, I placed the envelope on my desk and stood staring at it. The light outside was soft, that golden kind of October light that comes right before the trees start turning for real. I opened the top drawer of my little bookshelf and pulled out the keepsake box. Inside were the small things that had outlived their moment. A dried sprig of lavender wrapped in faded ribbon, a black and white photo of Dad and me on the porch steps, and the birthday card he gave me the year I turned 20. I sat down on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope. The letter inside was cool and formal, the kind of language lawyers liked. It said the house on Wisteria Hill, the one with the wraparound porch and camellias out front, had been transferred to Delilah. Full ownership, signed, sealed, official. There was no mention of me. I read it twice, 3 times, and still the words didn't sting. Not yet. Not like they should have. I just folded it back up, slid it beside the lavender, and picked up the birthday card. Dad's handwriting was crooked but careful. You've always had the good kind of quiet, the kind that listens. Graham appeared in the doorway, rubbing his neck. That from Ruth Ann? I nodded, then held up the letter. Do I want to ask? I tried to smile. They gave her the house. His brow furrowed just a little. Of course they did. I leaned back, breathing in the faint scent of the dried flowers. Do you remember when I used to say I felt invisible around them? All the time, he said, crossing the room and kneeling in front of me. You want to let them keep pretending you don't matter? I reached into the box and pulled out another slip of paper, an old draft of a will, one Dad had written in his own hand. My name was the only one mentioned. I stood slowly, still holding the envelope. I need to go back, I said, but not to take anything, just to see what's been taken. The mansion looked the same from the outside. That was the problem. The wrought iron gate let out a soft groan as it swung open. Spanish moss hung like tired lace from the old oak trees lining Wisteria Hill. The humidity hit me first, thick, familiar, almost sour with the scent of magnolias past bloom. Graham had slipped a sachet of lavender into my overnight bag that morning. In case the ghosts follow you home, he'd said with a half smile. I should have brought 2. Ruth Ann met me on the porch, arms open, smiling carefully placed. "Celeste, how nice of you to come all this way." Her perfume hit me like a memory I never liked. I stepped forward, suitcase in one hand. "It's been a while?" She kissed the air beside my cheek. "Well, let's not make it any longer next time." Then, glancing down at my bag, she added, "We've prepared the guest house. It's been freshly cleaned." "Not your room," I noted silently. "The same room with the quilt Dad's mother made. The cedar chest with my name carved in it. Just the guest house." Inside, Delilah emerged from the parlor like someone stepping onto a stage. She wore soft beige, her hair pinned, her expression warm, at least on the surface. "You look grounded," she said, her smile holding. "Charleston air suits you?" I didn't answer, just stepped forward and laid my hand on the banister, still notched from the summer we slid down it, and Ruth Ann nearly had a fit. "You always preferred being on the outside, didn't you?" Delilah said lightly, like it was a compliment. "I was usually left there," I replied, and the silence that followed was brief, but thick. Have you ever felt like they smiled to your face while quietly pushing you out the back door? If you've ever been treated like a guest in your own home, leave a comment number 8 below. Now let's see what happened next. Later, I walked out into the garden. The swing Dad built was gone. In its place stood a modern sculpture, 3 twisting bronze shapes that didn't mean a thing. The porch fan above me squeaked in lazy circles, pushing the warm air around. Cicadas sang like they always had. And then I heard it, a low hum. Turning, I spotted Mr. Dorsey, bent at the waist, tending to a hedge. He was older now, his back a little more curved, but the rhythm of his hands hadn't changed. He glanced up. Our eyes met. He gave a slow nod, then went back to trimming. I stood still for a moment, the scent of earth and magnolia drifting around us. My throat ached. I turned to go. "Some things were meant to be found again," he said softly behind me. "I kept something for you." He disappeared into the garden shed, and I heard the soft creak of a locked drawer opening. He placed the envelope in my hands like it was made of glass. I held my breath the whole time. The shed smelled the same after all these years. Old pine, rusted metal, lemon oil. A slow jazz tune crackled softly from a dusty radio in the corner, and Mr. Dorsey moved like memory, deliberate, quiet, never wasting energy on anything that didn't matter. He didn't speak at first, just poured hot water into a chipped mug, dropped in a slice of lemon, and handed it to me. No question. He remembered I never liked sugar. "Sit," he said, gesturing to an old stool by the workbench. He unlatched the top drawer with a key that looked older than the lock itself. Then he pulled out the envelope, worn but clean, and held it out like it might fall apart in the wrong hands. I took it with both palms, like a prayer. Years ago, when his wife had that second stroke, I'd heard they couldn't afford all the medication. I'd called the pharmacy, paid the difference quietly. No return address, no signature. He never mentioned it. I never expected he would. "This was meant for you," he said. "Your father gave it to me when things started looking not right." I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was the final will, signed, witnessed, dated 2 weeks before he passed. My name was written clear as day. Full heir. No conditions, no room for interpretation. "He told your mother," Mr. Dorsey added gently. "She wasn't pleased. Said it would only cause trouble. She asked me to leave. I took the will with me." I nodded slowly, the paper trembling in my hands. There was another sheet, folded behind it. A letter. Dad's handwriting, familiar and aching. "The house is yours, not because of blood, but because of how you see people. I didn't cry. I just folded it back and sat there for a long minute, the steam from the tea curling in the air like something alive. My phone buzzed in my bag. "Graham," I answered. "I have the will," I said. He was quiet then. "So, what's next?" I didn't answer right away. Just reached into my purse, wrapped the letter in linen from the tea towel beside me, and placed it in a new envelope, tucking it beside the sachet of lavender. I called Ruth Ann that night. "I'll be at Thanksgiving dinner," I said. "There's something I'd like to read." My place card sat at the far end of the table, away from the chandelier, away from the warmth, like it had always been. The room hadn't changed. Not really. The mahogany table still gleamed like it had never been used. The chandelier above still cast golden pools that didn't quite reach the corners. Ruth Ann always said dim light softened the lines in people's faces. I'd always thought it just made it easier to pretend. The scent of roasted turkey drifted in from the kitchen, thick with sage and butter. Pecan pie cooled on the sideboard, and somewhere in the distance, the grandfather clock let out a single, polite chime. Delilah floated in like the heroine of a holiday film. Soft beige dress, hair swept up, grace radiating like it had been rehearsed. She smiled when our eyes met. I held mine just long enough. I took my seat. The one furthest from the heat, from the fireplace, from the center of anything. Graham, beside me, touched my hand under the table. His thumb moved gently in circles. We didn't speak. Ruth Ann stood. Her voice was warm, polished. This year, I'm especially thankful for my legacy, for Grace, and for the daughter who stepped up when others stepped away. There were scattered nods, a few murmurs of approval. Delilah tilted her head modestly, like the spotlight wasn't hers, but she was willing to borrow it for the moment. I sipped my sweet tea. It was too cold. Or maybe my hand just wasn't warm enough anymore. As dishes clinked and small talk settled into its well-worn grooves, cruise plans, real estate, someone's daughter's college application, Ruth Ann cleared her throat again. "We have a small surprise," she said, as if announcing dessert, "to honor the one who carries this house forward." She lifted a cloth from the object beside her chair, a framed portrait of Delilah in front of the mansion's gate, brass plaque beneath, caretaker of Wisteria Hill. There was polite applause. I rose. Slowly. The envelope in my hand felt heavier than it had all week. I stepped forward and placed it beside the portrait. There's one more thing our father left behind. Every fork stills. Even Ruth Ann's breath catches. "If you'll allow," I said, "I'd like to read his last letter." The letter unfolded like memory, creases sharp, ink faded, but the words still clear as a bell. I stood at the far end of the table, the letter trembling just slightly in my hands. The chandelier light had softened, dimmed by intention or time, I wasn't sure. I touched the lavender sachet in my pocket. "You see clearer in the dark," my father used to say when the power went out. I guess he was right. I cleared my throat gently. This letter was written by my father the week before he passed. I never asked for it. He gave it anyway. No one moved. Graham sat still at my side, gaze steady. Delilah blinked at me like I'd broken a spell. Ruth Ann gripped her wine glass but didn't drink. "To my daughter Celeste, you've spent most of your life trying not to take up space, and I'm sorry for that. This house is yours, not because of blood, but because of how you see people. You listen when others speak, just to be heard. You stay quiet not from weakness, but because you know when silence matters. I trust you with this place because you understand what makes it a home isn't legacy. It's kindness." There was no anger in my voice. I wasn't here to shame them, just to be heard. "That letter is years old," Ruth Ann said finally, her voice clipped but unsteady. "It doesn't hold legal weight." A quiet knock at the door interrupted her. Mr. Dorsey stepped inside, his boots polished, shoulders squared. He walked slowly to the table and set down a folder. "It's not just a letter," he said softly. "It's a will, signed, witnessed, and dated." He opened it. Delilah stood up so fast her chair scraped. "You left!" she snapped. "You don't deserve this!" I looked at her, not with anger, but something closer to grief. Maybe I left because no one saw me when I stayed. Have you ever stayed, hoping someone would notice, but they never did? If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who should have known better, comment number 9 below. Let's find out how the truth finally found its voice. Mr. Dorsey didn't flinch. He turned to the room. "Your mother asked me to make the will disappear. Instead, I kept it safe, for when the time was right." No one spoke. Even the grandfather clock seemed to hold its breath. Ruth Ann quietly excuses herself. No denial. Just silence. I didn't repaint the mansion. I just opened the curtains. The light looked different now, warmer, slower, like it had been waiting to be let back in. I stood at the front porch, wearing my father's old cardigan, the sleeves too long, the elbows thin. The December air held a bite, but I left the windows cracked, let the house breathe again. I sipped sweet tea from a wide ceramic mug and watched the breeze dance through the camellia bushes Mr. Dorsey had planted along the east side. He'd moved into the old caretaker's quarters last week and brought with him a box of his late wife's gardening books. Said he planned to try her lemon balm recipe come spring. Inside, Graham was sanding the last plank for the new sign, Wisteria Hill Community House. The scent of sawdust mixed with cinnamon from Naomi's pie is still cooling on the side table. She'd dropped it off that morning with a smile and a gentle pat on my arm. "Healing's slow," she said, "but it grows where it's allowed." In the parlor, a group of local kids painted watercolors by the big bay window, their laughter echoing down the hallway. We started Saturday workshops 2 weekends ago. Next week would be the seniors' tea and reading circle. Mrs. Kenner already called dibs on the rocking chair by the fireplace. I hadn't heard from Ruth Ann, but Naomi told me she'd seen her walking past the gate one morning, bundled in her winter coat, pausing only for a moment before continuing down the street. Delilah sent a postcard. No return address. Just a single line. "You always were better at building something from nothing." That afternoon, I knelt by the front walkway and screwed a small brass plaque into the brick post. This house belongs to the quiet ones who kept showing up. There wasn't a ceremony, no announcement, just the sound of a screen door creaking open and the soft hum of jazz on the radio. I stepped back inside and ran my hand along the bookshelf in the front room. The first donation to our little library had come from a retired schoolteacher named Ruth Price. 5 novels, all annotated in the margins. I took my father's letter, still folded in linen, and placed it gently between the pages of her first book. And I finally turned the porch light on. For good. Some homes don't need new paint or new names. They just need someone willing to open the curtains again. That's what I learned in the stillness that followed the truth. Not all victories are loud, and not all kindness is recognized at first glance. We're often too quick to decide who belongs at the table and who doesn't, forgetting that the quietest voices sometimes carry the deepest roots. Like warm light spilling from a porch lamp, an act of quiet courage can reach further than we ever imagine. If this story stirred something familiar in you, I'd be honored if you shared it, or left a thought in the comments below. And if you'd like more stories that honor the strength in silence and the grace in choosing kindness, I hope you'll subscribe and stay a while.